Here's the book with my signature, where's the camera? There's the camera. Signature stickies coming out the side. It's called Soldiers, Blood, and Bloodied Money. And the author, and actually the subtitle is Wars and the Ruling Elites. And the author of that book is here in the studio today with me, Alan Clark.
Well, I'm delighted, Debbie. Thank you.
So nice to have you here. Thank you for being here. Well, I'm going to give a little bit more of an introduction to you for our listeners. First, I will just tell you as a little personal and fun aside. A few years ago, and I was trying to remember on the way here, it was February 2017. Is that what it was when we were in Israel? But
yes.
Yeah, my husband and my husband's on a business trip to Israel. I joined him. Well, it turned out that Alan Clark and his wife Linda were also in Israel on a touring trip, not business, but touring. Anyway, we had breakfast in a hotel, the four of us did, in Israel, kind of a fun thing. But Alan Clark is a longtime friend, but I want you to know a bit about his life story before we talk about his book. So I'm going to just start with a few things about his life story that matter so much to what he wrote about. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was a West Pointer, 1963. 1966, he volunteered for service in the Army in Vietnam. So he is a Vietnam veteran. While serving in Vietnam, he was injured, an enemy mortar barrage, and bottom line of it was he was hospitalized and eventually resulted in having his amputation of both legs below his knees. On top of that, multiple surgeries. So he has served our country, obviously suffered a significant life-altering injury during his service in Vietnam, went through what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, suffering from those kind of the loss and change in your life, and you can imagine being the athletic person you must be when you're able to graduate from West Point and then realize in the rest of your life you're going to go through life very changed. He received all sorts of awards, Silver Star, the third highest decoration for gallantry in action, Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantryman's Badge. He's also served politically in our country. He served the President George H.W. Bush as the Assistant Secretary for Veterans Liaison and Program Coordination and Director of the National Cemetery System in the U.S. Department of Veterans. On top of all that, I want to get to, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but the other thing that Alan Clark does I just love is over the years, my husband and I have attended lunches his organization sponsors, and it's filled with military veterans and some people still serving. And my husband and I will kind of, we kind of duck our heads a little bit low because we're strong patriots, but neither of us are veterans. But when you go to these lunches, he has fabulous speakers describing situations in the military, describing their service, describing all sorts of things related to the defense of America. And the room is just brimming with patriotism, love of America, willingness to serve, love of our military. And this is just all done because you love the military. So I wanted to share those little tidbits before we got started.
That's very kind of you.
Well, they're amazing and lunches. We do end up feeling like, my gosh, if you never serve in the military, most Americans have no idea what the military life entails, just none.
That's true. Most of us have a very special spirit of affinity and comradeship with each other, but we also like people such as you and Eric that are such great patriots, I can assure you.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to start with our talk today. I want to start with this book, and again, it's called Soldiers, Blood, and Bloodied Money, Wars and the Ruling Elite. Okay, the camera isn't usually over there. I'm trying to turn it the right way. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so tell me why you wrote this book. I'd love just to hear what motivated you to write this.
Well, I started out 12 years ago with my own autobiography about Vietnam, my wounding and my healing story and my healing through my Christian faith from post-traumatic stress. And then I wrote a second book called Valor in Vietnam about stories about soldiers of Vietnam and sailors and airmen and Marines and an Army nurse and so forth. And then I started getting into wars and studying history. I've always loved history. So I started beginning to ask, well, what in the world were the real stories behind how these wars started and conducted? And especially, a lot of people write war stories. But my stories are stories about what I call the usual suspects that I've found out about that get us into wars for personal profit and fulfillment of greed. And I call it a seeking of cupidity. Okay,
and then cupidity. Cupidity. CUPIDITY.
Yeah, cupidity. And then I just cover four major wars that we fought in specifically: American Revolution, Civil War, Spanish American, and what I call the banana banker and oil wars in Central America. Much so spearheaded by a two-time Medal of Honor recipient, Major General Smedley Butler in the Marines. So the combination, I started looking at this history, and what we had been told were the reasons that we went to these wars were not necessarily the truth, and there was something behind them that was economic. And so I started getting into that, and I started buying books that were 100, 125 years old, antiquarian bookstores and so forth, and started getting into it, and just fascinated with the different aspects and elements that were behind the wars that caused the casualties. And I cover casualties. There's no holds barred on the casualties. War is not it's not a blow the bugles and wave the flags and charge. There's after effects. I'm an example.
Yes, you are. Well, actually, I want to focus on one of the wars you talk about, the Revolutionary War, and then I want to turn and talk about Syria and Turkey and the Kurds. But to be clear, so your book, you talk a lot about the unknown reasons, unknown to the average American,
Yes.
for the wars that we get into. So, for example, the Revolutionary War, people talk about it and we have pride in America because of the outcome, because we got around to having the Declaration of Independence and building a country around the idea that we each have rights from God simply because we're born. That's what the Declaration starts out saying, the structure of America, the Constitution. So the creating of what I often say in the show is the most extraordinary experiment in human liberty ever in the world, America. But you talk in here about, and so we talk about, well, yay, we got into this Revolutionary War because we wanted to stand up for the right of men to live in freedom and live in liberty. And we got to that conclusion with the Declaration and the Constitution. But talk a little bit about the financial things that occurred ahead of time that got us to where we on the Revolutionary War.
Well, the French and Indian War cost Great Britain a lot of money for 7 years, and they wanted us to pay the bill for the war that we had fought, plus the British had fought against the French and the Indians. So they said, okay, we're going to have a debt from this. America, you're going to pay us. They put all sorts of taxes on us, all sorts of special things. We could not issue our own coinage. We could not issue our own money. And they said, you will only use the English pound. So this led to a lot of smuggling by our people. We just didn't worry about that. People know about the Tea Party and everything. But just so many, it was like original taxation without representation. And we just finally said, and it started up in Boston, with Samuel Adams and people like that.
One of my heroes, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
and we're gonna take this country back, and we're gonna run it ourselves. We're not gonna let these people run it. And with the church, especially the Anglican Church is in control in Virginia and partially in New York. We've just had it. We don't want this anymore. So we're gonna fight for it. And we fought and we won.
So that war, even though there were unknown to most people financial reasons behind England's pressing of taxation, which we felt was unfair, our forebears thought were unfair, and we were saying we didn't have representation, so that was our reason. We still got to a right conclusion in getting into that war and fighting for our independence. Or the outcome is so great, you kind of say, okay, whatever the finances were not problematic. Is that right? Or?
The financial reasons that pushed Britain to put these onerous taxes on us and constraints on us financially was what really pushed us over the edge.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that control. They had the government, they had the governors, they controlled everything. So we were basically a vassal state of Great Britain. That's what it boiled down to. And they were not, we didn't control our own destiny. And just a whole lot of things like that relative to the economics. But it was just an oppressive colony, and it took a long time, almost 200 years, for everybody else to get out of the yoke of the British Empire. It was after World War II before other people caught up with us from 1776.
Yes, it's true. I'm tempted to get off on a side, but I won't do that. I'll stay focused. Something interesting I just thought about that was related to actually, I'll tell you quickly, there was a book written by Brett Baer that deals with FDR, and we just had a little event at our home featuring him. It was the Tehran Conference, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, talking about, how are we going to stop Hitler? And they had to get a plan they all could agree on. It became D-Day was the ultimate name of the plan, but they were talking at this time, trying to figure out what to do. And part of what Churchill was bothered by, even in that era, in World War II, Churchill was bothered by what FDR seemed to be signaling was, ultimately, you have to stop having all these colonies. You can't really keep India as your colony. And even then, which seems relatively recent history, Churchill's saying, I'm not too sure, but he didn't like that talk. But anyways.
Well, they depended upon Australians and, Indians and Pakistan and everybody all over the world. They depended upon them to fight for the British Empire.
Yes.
And, they could possibly, if they wanted to, after about 47 or 48, once they formed the Commonwealth. But before that, they were basically required to serve. And so if Great Britain went to war in World War I, World War II, everybody had to go fight.
So the colonies served them militarily.
Sure.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Well, now I want to ask you, because you have studied, and we can't go into the astounding depth of your book and all of the different intricacies, so I wanted to just pick some particular issues I mentioned to you before we got together today. Given what you understand about the armaments industry and actually I made a little list, I wouldn't leave them all out. The armaments industry, the religious entities, leaders, politicians, bankers, media titans, lawyers, secret societies, all of that really playing behind the scenes in decisions America made throughout history, going to war, which I mean, honestly, people don't know anything about that.
And that hasn't changed, Debbie. That hasn't changed. It is these powerful elitists and these different special interest groups that still get us into wars again, so that our young people, they join the military for this or that reason, education, patriotism, family legacy, whatever the case may be. We're the ones that go carry it. The people in the boardrooms, they don't fight.
Right.
They just direct the financial aspects and so forth.
So what's your sense, because it's a particularly challenging thing in America and the world today, dealing with the threat of radical Islam, dealing with the aggression, for example, of Turkey, and we've talked about in the show about Erdogan, the leader of Turkey. He's, in many people's accounting, he's a jihadist. He's right there with the idea of jihad in Islam. So in that kind of context, you had Turkey, and the recent discussion was Turkey was going to invade into northern Syria, and we, Americans, had in the past sided with the Kurds. Kurds had helped us fight ISIS, and people thought President Trump was wrong to pull our military back from northern Syria, fail to protect the Kurds, and essentially enable Erdogan's incursion. And so I don't know, in the complexities of what you understand, the causes of war, what was your sense about President Trump's decision to pull American troops away?
Can I give you a little background?
Absolutely.
All right. Number one, about 2009, very few people know that Qatar and Saudi Arabia wanted to have a natural gas pipeline from Saudi Arabia and, natural gas from Qatar through Jordan into Syria and offload it in Syria for the European market and get into competition with Russia. Okay. Assad did not want to let that happen. So automatically the lobbyists that wanted to make money off Qatar and Saudi Arabia natural gas going there, they couldn't make their money anymore. So I don't trust these politicians anymore. So what it was pushing Obama to then go into Syria and decide that he would join the Sunni operation there to go against Assad, who was allied with the Shiites in Iran. So he said, okay, we're going to put a certain amount of special forces troops in there. We're going to help the Kurds. We're going to try to overthrow the Assad government for a variety of reasons. And he talked about genocide. Well, the fact is that whole Benghazi operation was set up by the State Department to take arms that they had pulled out of Libya during Gaddafi's tour, put it in that secret base in Benghazi. What was a State Department ambassador doing in a little mission with about 6 or 8 Americans? He was directing that to ships leaving Benghazi, going up into Syria, going up into Turkey, being offloaded to help the people overthrow Assad. So part of it was that they couldn't get their pipeline. That was number one. And number two, well, let's overthrow him. Well, what right do we have to overthrow Assad? That's his country. Those are his people. I mean, we just can't fight all these wars. Americans have gone time and time again. The fact is that the Kurds and also Iraqis are the ones that got rid of ISIS. The Kurds have a very interesting thing that people don't quite know about, and that's their PKK, which is their terrorist organization that has been against Turkey for many, many years. The original founder of PKK is a guy named Öcalan, who was a communist. and he is a Marxist, and he's in prison in Turkey, but he's still directing the efforts. So it's all nice and good to say, well, these Kurds are great friends of ours, and certain Kurds are good friends of ours. They helped us up in the north of Iraq. But the fact is that little group called the PKK, they're terrorists. They're terrorists against Turkey. Turkey has protected our flank against Russia for NATO. So we have kind of conflicting opinion. We want to support the Kurds. We want to support Turkey. I personally think that the deal was, we know we can get Baghdadi. So let's get Baghdadi, and Turkey says, he's about 5 kilometers from Turkey.
That was my next question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, we'll let you get him, but the trade-off politically is you're going to allow us to go into the Kurd area, and we need to set up that barrier, okay?
Right.
Because we want to get Assad, and so we want a barrier there between us and bring these Syrian refugees back into their own country.
So the PKK within Turkey has been attacking Turkey. I mean, Turkey's in part saying, look, these people are pummeling us all the time.
Yeah.
We're pushing back because we don't want them doing that to us. So there's so much complexity over there. So
it is
Yeah.
Like they've said, a puzzle with an enigma. I mean, you name it.
Yeah.
It's like one of those little Russian.
keep pulling it.
You keep pulling. There's something else underneath,
Yeah. So in fact, what you just said, I had read some speculation. It made perfect sense to me. The idea that we pulled our troops back, but actually, in fact, when the Baghdadi capture or the killing of him was announced, someone, and I think it was President Trump, had said, "Yeah, this was actually this was in plan and operation for 2 weeks," meaning before he'd even announced that we're pulling our troops back.
It might have been a quid pro quo, and allow the Turks to do it. You're only Baghdadi. We know he's only 5 kilometers from Turkey, so we're going to go get him. And Turkey said, "Okay, we're going to let you do that, but this is the trade-off."
Yeah. So, on your broader sense of what, because, you do write and have spoken about the tremendous harm, and obviously not just to our soldiers, we get into wars maybe we should or should not be in, or we stay in too long, but soldiers, their families, the whole of the American culture and fabric and community feels the pain of wars that we didn't need to be in. Right now, though, with dealing with radical Islam, which you and I have talked about before, we've heard speakers talk about before, we have, I think, an obligation, or let me state it as a question. Do you agree that America, that it's a justifiable reason to be engaged in some military action if we are fighting back against Islamic jihadist aggression, or do we need to only be doing that if they're at the borders of America?
No, we need to do it with our special operations forces, which is what it was. Obama put 500 special forces, special operations people there. They're the ones who were working with the Kurds, okay? They're the ones that wiped out ISIS, but Iraq got troops in there to help us out also. It wasn't just a Kurdish American deal. The Iraqis were helping us out there. So, and the Turks at one time, they don't especially want ISIS, all right, to be attacking them, but it's all right if they attack others. This fella in Turkey, he is really an Islamist, okay?
Erdogan, you're talking about?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He's really an Islamist, and I'm not sure that he's a proper guy to be in NATO, but we do have an air base there, and we do have a naval base in Turkey. So we've got some Americans that they could be surrounded, and they could be wiped out if we push them too far. Now, they had their reasons for wanting to go into that area, and the Kurds should have had their own country after World War I. They were in 4 different areas. When France and Britain divided up the world, they should have given the Kurds their own country back then, but that didn't happen. So they have been just kind of a people without a country all this time. But now Trump put in 2,200 special forces people, which means SEALs, Delta Force, Rangers, Army Special Forces, and the Special Operations helicopter operation, which is what went in to get Baghdadi. So we haven't had a whole lot of troops there once Obama pulled the American troops out of Iraq. But we have just enough to quell them down. But ISIS is not just there. ISIS has stuff all over the world. They're in Africa, they're in South America, they're just all over the world.
And it's an interesting thing. We've talked about difference. In fact, I can't remember the young people's name, but there were 2, I think it was 2 Americans that were in one of the former Uzbekistan, whatever one of those countries, one of those where ISIS has infiltrated. 2 American students bicycling and proving to the world that everything is cool here, and they were killed by ISIS. And then there was a group, I think they're Australian young people, who were proving again trying to tell the world there's nothing to fear here, everywhere you go is safe. And they were in maybe Morocco and were killed by ISIS. And the point, every time I read about this, ISIS is spread everywhere. And so the savvy use of American military, it seems, ought to be more special force targeting, tracking them down, because it's not a traditional war. You line the troops up.
It's not tanks against tanks and coming out of foxholes anymore. It's an asymmetric warfare, which means we have to go out. It's a different kind of a thing where we have to go after individuals. But special forces and SEALs are trained for these operations.
Yeah,
to go after the bad guys.
To go after,
just like Baghdadi. You know, the Baghdadi's last words were, "I didn't know we had a dog."
Yeah. I saw that. You know what? I saw that on wherever I saw it online. I didn't know when did we get a dog or something?
Where'd that big dog come from?
Which is so funny because, as our listeners likely know, in Islam, for some reason, I guess because Muhammad didn't like dogs, all of Islam is kind of has had that thought that dogs
It's a cultural deal. You know, in the Philippines, it was a pork deal. You know, the pigs and so forth. They don't want pigs around. Pork.
Oh, yeah. Pigs, pork, and dogs. Well, so it's interesting. I think that for people, and I am certainly guilty of it, I am such a pro-America, pro-Revolutionary War. I love the idea in the Civil War that even though we didn't start out with a mission of ending slavery, it wasn't this pure mission you're taught in elementary school, that we had to decide about slavery, and we did the right thing, and we went forward as a country and realized that if all men are created equal, it means we have to get rid of slavery. There's so many more complicating factors behind the scenes and financial things that really were the instigator. And it's kind of funny. It's like on the one hand, your book is kind of attacking my what's the right word? Kind of America-loving dreams. But you love America, you love the military, but you're just saying people should understand the factors in play behind the scenes.
What's really behind it? Who's making money? Follow the money. That's the bottom line. Civil War, follow the money. Who's making money off this? The slavery was a big issue, and I'm sure glad that slavery was gotten rid of in this country. No question about it. It's just horrible. It's been horrible since the beginning of time for anybody to be slaves. I'm glad we got rid of that. But there were some other issues involved. And I cover in the Civil War assassination attempt by presidents of the United States by Southern sympathizers because they did not want states to come in as slavery states. They wanted to get rid of them. And I also cover the French coming into Mexico. I mean, I did an extensive, amazing, in my mind, amazing.
Yes, it was amazing.
Research.
I can agree with you. Yeah.
Over 100 books in the bibliography, plus over 200 footnotes, much less all that. It just, people don't know anything about this. Did you know? When people read that, did you know France attacked Mexico in 1861? Invaded Mexico?
Yeah,
people controlled it for 6 years.
Yeah, people don't know those things, and that kind of starry-eyed love of America thing. You could read the things that you write about and think, well, gee, that kind of tarnishes my sense of American history. But really, what you want ultimately is truth. You want to know facts and truth.
If that's the fact, accept it. But it's not America in general. It's not the middle class. It's not the basic, good, solid, working Americans. It's the people at the top, those elitists that sit in their boardrooms and they make their money, and they have through history by using the little people to do the things they have for expansionism, for territorial gains, for economic gains, and for building their wealth. That's what happens.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, and we're getting toward closing on this discussion about this book, but, this idea of becoming more informed is one step, and it is a good step, and understanding what really happened, really motivated things. But no one likes to feel like your strings are pulled, that you're a puppet, like you thought you cheerfully went off to Vietnam to stand up against communism and stand for the free world, and yet behind the scenes, all sorts of strings are pulled, and money was changing hands, and people sitting around boardrooms. So this may be an impossible last question. My dad used to use the expression all the time. We talk about he loved to talk about world history and social causes and anyway, he always would end up with, "'Twas ever thus." It's always been that way. And so is this how it will always be, or is your book written in part because people could probably begin to expose this and maybe change the influence and power of this cabal that seems to be pulling so many strings, shaping America's foreign policy?
Well, the American electorate needs to be sure they understand before we send people off to war. What's the real reason? Ask questions. Get away from their TVs and their sitcoms and so forth. Pay attention. Go to the town halls. Listen to what people are saying and say, does that make sense, what that politician is saying? Do we really need to do that? Who's going to make, the big thing, who's going to make money off this?
Yeah.
You know, what company is going to sell the weapons, whether needed or not, for their profits? What's the propaganda, which was a big deal in the Spanish-American War? What lawyers like John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan that made a heck of a lot of money helping the Germans build up in the 30s?
Right.
That's one of the other things I couldn't get into just very barely here. But these are the kinds of things that we need to pay attention to.
You know, that was very well said. You know, I was thinking of an analogy about how in America, we always say we're so grateful for we have all the developments of modern medicine, and we have pharmaceutical companies, and look at the great things they do. They come up with new drugs and they test them and they help people. But pharmaceutical companies are also inspired to sell what they create. And so they sell, essentially, end up selling to people things they don't need. In fact, there was a book, Selling Sickness. That was what it was called. It was about the pharmaceutical companies determined to sell their drugs by selling sickness, by tantalizing people to think, well, you know, did you ever have the experience of blah, blah, blah happens? You probably have this disease. You probably need this. Well, it's kind of interesting. We like to think of our armaments industries, the parallel I'm making, armaments industries as people who are just loyal Americans wanting to fund and prepare our soldiers to have the best equipment possible so when we go to war, we can win it. And you're saying, actually, I'll let you close on this, the armaments industry is actually more likely to be encouraging the war to be able to continue production and sale of what they make. Is that right?
Because they're pushed by the profits, they're pushed by their stockholders to have higher earnings per share. I have an exact example of this. I was involved several years ago with getting a Fisher House down at the VA Medical Center so that the families that came in that have their sons and daughters sick there could stay for $10 a night. We had to pull teeth to get the arms merchants in the areas to donate money for that. These are the guys and gals in their big boardrooms again that make money off sending our troops off overseas to get hurt and to get maimed and come back and get old and get sick, and their families come to the hospital. We couldn't get all the money we needed.
Yeah.
It was I was so dispirited, dispirited.
Yep. Alan Clark, thank you for the astonishing amount of research you obviously did to produce such a book. And again, my friends, looking at the correct camera, we are looking at the correct camera. There we go. This is Soldier's Blood and Bloodied Money, Wars and the Ruling Elite. You can get this on Amazon.
Right.
And also, do you have a website of your own that you'd like to tell our listeners about?
Well, my website is combatfaith.com. That's my main website to help veterans heal with post-traumatic stress. I put that together about 15 years ago, combatfaith.com.
Combatfaith.com.
Yeah.
Alan Clark, thank you so much. Thank you for coming in.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
So happy you could be here.